Well, welcome back to episode 9 of Bible Basics. And today we're going to talk about the New Testament's context. I've talked to you about the Bible's title, the titles of the two testaments, the table of contents for the New Testament, and the authors, the order of the books. Today I want to talk about the context. In other words, things that are outside the table of contents, the context for how the table of contents came to be. When the New Testament first came together, the table of where the people that produced those copies of the New Testament, where they got their table of contents, was from the churches. The churches at that time were geographically dispersed and organizationally independent. Each churches were governed usually by a bishop who ruled over all the churches in a city or in a region. And those bishops were independent of each other. One bishop didn't have to do exactly what the other bishop did. So sometimes there was a little bit of differences between which apostolic writings were read in the church services and which were not. And or let me rephrase that. Sometimes the difference between the apostolic writings that were read in the church and other writings. And it wasn't until the 3rd, or really the 4th and 5th century, until all the different churches all over the Roman Empire got to agree on what these New Testament writings would be. And what they would each do is publish a list of what they read in the churches. When we look at our table of contents, we don't have to, but it's helpful to know that when these table of contents were produced, it wasn't people sitting around a table said, okay, guys, what do we want to include in this thing? What would you like to include? All right, what about you? What are your thoughts? That's not the way it happened at all. The way it happened was the apostles wrote documents, letters, or these gospels, and they were meant to be distributed to the churches, sometimes to a single church and then spread beyond that, and then other times to groups of churches. Like Galatians was to churches all over the region of Galatia, which is in what we call Asia Minor today. The book of Revelation was sent to 7 different churches. The book of Hebrews was sent to Hebrews, in other words, to Jews of that time, and they could be scattered all over the place. The letter of James sent to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, talking about, all the believers. He's probably using that term metaphorically to apply to all the believers, because the church, viewed itself as spiritual Israel. So these documents were circulating. They didn't have a printing press back then. They'd have to hand copy them. It took a long time to get all these letters circulated to all the churches. And of course, there's new churches forming, and so that's why it took hundreds of years, that and a number of other reasons why it took several hundred years for all these documents to be collected. But that table of contents came from each bishop in his area saying, okay, these are the books we read. And their lists were, once the list started coming out, they were very, very similar. And it wasn't long before they ironed out whatever differences they had, and everybody was using the same things. And they didn't need a church council to decide it. They didn't have a bishop to decide it, or a group of bishops to decide it. There was no organization, no pope, no archbishop, no cardinal. There was nobody who could say, okay, these are the books that are going to go in there. Even the Roman emperor, when Constantine became a Christian, he didn't rule on which books would go in there. In fact, he didn't even rule that they had to be the same all over the empire. Now, they ended up being the same, but they were the same because everyone ended up agreeing. Now, if you know anything about church history, that's a pretty rare thing for churches to agree about anything. How could they come to agreement about that? Well, it would be like saying, well, what if there were what if there's a counterfeiter and he's counterfeiting money all over the country, and they figured out what all the counterfeit bills were, and they figured out what all the real bills were. Well, the real currency is proven. The people who are experts in these things can identify which ones they are. Well, these books of the Bible, they knew they didn't have to be experts in anything. It traced back from one generation to the previous generation and so on until that's how they traced these documents from the beginning. Hey, my great-great-grandpappy, was a part of the church at Thessalonica. When Paul's letters came there, he remembered them being read in the church. So the table of contents is telling us what was read in the churches. The publishing of Bibles came after that. And so when it doesn't have any explanation. Like when you're looking at your table of contents, it's going to look like mine in the Bible, and it's not going to have an explanation of how this book got in there and how that book got in there. You just got a list. You're working off a list, and the list was what was read in the churches. And it's all been the same since roughly the 4th and 5th century. It's been the same ever since then, and that's when the list started appearing. So in other places, in my writings, and maybe the videos too, eventually, I go through a lot of detailed explanation about all that happened. It's very interesting. But it's also a little bit like watching paint dry, because it just wasn't a dramatic thing. Churches back then, just like churches now, they argued over matters of interpretation. But which books are in the New Testament is not a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of investigation. It was a matter of those people investigating the sources of those documents that they got. So that's all part of the context of how this came together. No explanation for what's in there. So if we want to know what they included and why they included it, well, if we want to know what they included, we just look at the new table of contents. If we want to know why they included it, each one, we have to just look at them and say, okay, what do these 27 texts have in common that none of the other Christian texts of that time period have? What trait or quality do these writings have that other Christian writings didn't? Because there was a lot of Christian writing being produced. There still is today. It's just a nature of it's the nature of the faith. Jesus lived. He was a historical figure. We have the Gospels. We have these letters. And the faith is basically communicated in large measure, or at least substantiated and documented by writing. So what all these have in common that the others don't is that all these were written in the first century by apostles or under the immediate supervision of apostles. So Matthew and John and Peter and Paul, they were apostles. Then you've got Luke and Mark, who were co-workers of those apostles and worked under the direction. And then you have James and Jude, who were Jesus' earthly brothers, initially skeptical of his ministry, but later they come around and they worked alongside and with the apostles. But they were all first century. They're all in that first generation of which Jesus had been a part. And there's two kinds of writings that did not make it. And we can categorize them in the following two ways. And these are my terms. And that is, first of all, honorable mentions and rejects. So let me do the rejects first, because it's easy to understand why they'd be rejected, or easier. Because these writings from the apostles garnered such attention and respect and were important. I mean, when you came to church, when you would go to church back then, you would hear these things written in the church. And they had gotten that practice from the Jews, who, when they gathered in synagogues, they would read from the prophets, what we call the Old Testament. And so the difference between a Jewish synagogue and a Christian church was primarily that the Jewish synagogues, of course, were reading from their prophets and talking about their nation and what they'd been through and what God had done for them and what God was promising for the future. And then the churches would be doing the same thing, only they'd be reading from the prophets and from the apostles, because the apostles obviously documented, bore witness to Jesus Christ. So these apostles became very, very prominent, especially after they died, and people began imitating them. Some people imitated them respectfully. That is to say, well, I've got an idea, and I'm kind of a nobody, but I'm gonna put it as an homage to Paul. I'm gonna say it's from Paul. I'm gonna make it like Paul's letters. Well, however well-intentioned that may be, that's fraudulent. The person in that case was not Paul, and he should not have been pretending to be Paul. And when the churches found out about this, they would not read them in the churches because they didn't want to be reading something that wasn't true. If they stood up in church and said, I'm reading the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, they wanted to know that it was really from the Apostle Paul. Another kind of reject was just from out-and-out crooks, people that were trying to gain a following or figured out some money-making scheme. If they could say that, okay, I found this letter of James, or I found this letter of Timothy, and we can put that in there. Or we had not put that in there. I'm being anachronistic. Let's get that read in church. They wouldn't have it. The people, just like the Jews would read from the prophets, the Christians wanted to read from the apostles and the prophets. They wanted real apostles. They didn't want fakes. They didn't want to be reading any writings as apostolic that weren't really from the apostles. So those are the rejects. There's different types of rejects, and you can find them still. Some of them still exist today. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas. These are documents that were not written by the people named. And we know that because the churches who received all these documents sorted it out. They didn't want to be tricked any more than we did. They don't want to be passing counterfeit money, so to speak, any more than we would. And so they weeded all those things out. When documents are handwritten, it's a little bit easier to kind of trace where they came from, how they got here. It's not like a mass market today where things are coming from all over the place. And sold in bookstores and online and that sort of thing. And then the other kind of documents that didn't get in would be what I'd call honorable mention. And these would be good, edifying, spiritually edifying documents by people like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp. These men were called apostolic fathers because they came in that very next generation after the apostles. And a lot of times they knew some of the apostles, one or more of the apostles, and had actually been taught by them at some time. But they were not old enough to have actually worked on those apostolic teams like Mark and Luke did. And they weren't included. Now, there's not a great deal of written back then, certainly not in the New Testaments that were published themselves, about why they drew the line there. There's not a great deal of explanation, but that's where they drew the line. No matter how edifying, how intelligent, how orthodox, how wonderful a writing could be, if it was written in a later generation, if it was written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, anything like that, it wasn't going to be included. The only thing that got included in the New Testament are writings that were written by that apostolic cohort, that apostolic team that existed in that age. So that brings us back to, this is a very select group, and we'll pick it up there next time. But that's the context. Lots of Christian literature, only 27 texts get selected. They don't want anything that's not actually written by the person who they said it's written by. See you next time.